Hi there, humanity. My name is Don. I'm an alien. But don't worry, we come in peace.
You don't speak for us.
I definitely don't come in peace.
Exactly. If peace happens, then fine.
Then what should I say?
You know what? Tell them we come in peace, and then they won't be expecting an invasion.
Ooh, tell them we come in peace.
Welcome to the Paranormal UFO Fringe News Roundup and Conspiracy Breakdown. Man, oh man, do we have a good one for you this week. This week we're going to be listening to a classic radio interview from Silas M. Newton from 1948 regarding the alleged flying saucer crash in Aztec, New Mexico. According to Newton, in March of 48, an unidentified aerial craft containing 16 humanoid bodies was recovered by military in New Mexico after making a controlled landing in Hart Canyon, 12 miles northeast of the city of Aztec. The craft was said to be 99 feet long, which is 30 meters in diameter, which is the largest UFO to date. Reportedly, the incident had been covered up by the military, and they'd taken the craft off for secret research.
In the summer of 1949, while engaged in magnetic research in the Mojave Desert in California, I was driving one day with one of my associates who happens to be rated the top magnetic scientist of the United States. In conversation with this gentleman, I had occasion to mention a report about flying saucers. I said, "Doctor, do you happen to know anything about them?" His answer was startling. He said to me, "I thought about you last week when I came down from Denver to Phoenix. When I passed Aztec, New Mexico, I said to my wife, I wish Si was here because I would take him out and show him where the first flying saucer landed in the United States." I said, "Doctor, do you mean to tell me that one of these ships landed and that the American people don't know anything about it?" He said, "Two telescopes saw this flying saucer, or an unidentified ship, and they watched its position on the telescope and estimated approximately where it would land. Within 2 to 3 hours after the landing, Air Force officials reached the flying field at Durango and took off in their search for this object. When they found it, it was in a very rocky, high plateau territory about 16 miles east of Aztec, New Mexico. They immediately threw a guard around it, and about 7 of our magnetic group of scientists were called in to examine this strange ship. When we arrived on the ground, we decided that the best thing to do was not to touch it or try to get into it. We studied the ship from a distance for a matter of 2 days. We even went so far as to bombard the ship with cosmic rays with an idea that if there was any danger to be developed, we wanted to find it out, if possible, before examining the ship at close quarters. Finally, we decided that it was probably safe, as nothing had happened or transpired inside the ship to indicate that there was life therein, and we began a closer examination. Apparently, there was no door to what unquestionably was the cabin. We found a broken porthole of what appeared at first examination to be glass. But on closer examination, we found it was a good deal different from any glass in this country. Finally, we used a large pole and rammed a hole through this portion of the ship. Having done this, we looked into the interior. There we were able to count 16 bodies of little people that ranged in height from about 36 to 42 inches. We assumed that there must be a door of some kind, so we prodded around with the pole, which we had pushed through the opening made through the broken porthole, and on the opposite side from the broken porthole, we found a knob, or a double knob to be exact, on the wall, and when we pushed against that, to our amazement and surprise, what turned out to be the door flew open. This enabled us to get into the ship. We took the little bodies out and laid them on the ground. we examined their clothing. The first thing that struck us was that so far as style goes, some of the boys said that looks like about 1890 style. We examined the bodies very closely and very carefully. They were normal from every standpoint and had no appearance of being what we call on this planet midgets. They were perfectly normal in their development. The only trouble was that their skin seemed to be charred, a very dark chocolate color. About the only thing that we could decide was that this had possibly occurred somewhere in space and that they had been killed as a result of the breaking of the porthole window. We then began an examination of the ship itself. First, we decided to make complete measurements of the ship from the outside. It was what we would call aluminum colored. From rim to rim of the ship, and the reports that had appeared from time to time in the papers about these strange visitors were and had always been to the effect that they looked like flying saucers. With this ship on the ground, we could not help but be aware of the fact that it looked like a huge saucer, and you might also almost say that there was a cup in it, because the cabin set in an insert in the bottom of the saucer. The overall dimensions of the ship were found to be almost exactly 100 feet in diameter. To be exact, it was 99 feet wide. From the outer tip of the wing, which of course was entirely circular, to the bottom of the saucer, measuring in an imaginary line vertically, was 27 inches. The cabin, which was entirely round, was 18 feet across and 72 inches in height. 45 inches of the cabin was exposed above the outer rim of the saucer. The portholes were located at this point. The doctor said that he did not recall at that moment how many portholes there were in the ship, but that there were several. On getting into the ship, he said that their first objective was to decide, if they could, how the ship was propelled. The doctor said that he was among the first to suggest that it probably flew on magnetic lines of force. Some of the boys, he said, suggested that somebody should push some of the buttons on what appeared to be the instrument board. But all agreed that would be about the worst possible thing to do, because if the ship would start, nobody knew which buttons to push to stop it again. So the result was that none of us, he said, touched any button on the instrument board. There were two what Doctor called bucket seats sitting in front of the instrument board, and two of the little fellows were sitting there. They had fallen over face down on the instrument board. Now it appeared that this ship, if flying on magnetic lines of force, must have had an automatic type of control, so that when it became in danger, when it did not have available its occupants in a position to operate it, simply settled quietly to Earth, it already having flown into our atmospheric area. Now, none of us could arrive at any conclusion as to when or how this window had broken, or at what possible point in space could these occupants have been killed. The simple facts were that there they were, and we proceeded with the further examination of the interior of the ship. We found some pamphlets or booklets which in all probability dealt with navigation problems. However, we were unable to decipher any of the writing which we judged to be a pictorial type of writing. All of these booklets were turned over to certain officials of the Air Force, who in turn reported that they were going to have them placed in the hands of men experienced in translating work of this kind. I asked the doctor immediately if he had heard of any success. He said at the latest report there had been no headway made of any kind in working out a translation of the written subject matter of the booklets. He said there were not any maps, and he said so far as they could determine, there was not an instrument of destruction or any kind of firearms as we know them inside the ship. Studying the matter, Doctor pointed out to me that this, of course, was unnecessary because if the ship was operated magnetically, it unquestionably had the means by which it could demagnetize any object in its path and thereby disintegrate such an object. This, of course, would be possible both as human beings on this earth or, for that matter, any form of matter which they came in contact with on this planet. Well, I said, Doctor, what do you make of this whole thing? Where do you think these ships come from? He said, well, of course, we don't know. But he said, our best thought at the moment is that it's entirely possible that they have flown here from the planet Venus. I asked him why they had decided this. Well, he said, in all the latest research regarding the possibility of life on other planets, it was fairly well agreed among quite a school of thought in astronomical research that the planet Venus could in all possibilities sustain life, and that it was much more likely that there was human habitation on the planet Venus than on the planet Mars. Dr. even went so far as to say that if there were any human beings on the planet Mars, they would probably be 3 or 4 times as large as human beings on this planet. And since these people range in height from about 36 to 42 inches, that, of course, ruled out, in their judgment, Mars. Day after day, over the period of the next 90 days following this first talk about this spaceship, or as we came to talk of it, this flying saucer, I made it my business on all types of occasions, most of them when I was entirely alone with Doctor, and we were in the midst of research in our magnetic work. I came up with questions at the most inopportune times, because it must be understood that I felt that I owed it to myself to run this thing down to where I could finally decide whether or not this was a true story. And in telling my findings, I am not now going to try to follow any sequence of events, but simply recall all that I had to ask and note it here regardless of its possible order of inquiry. I said, Doctor, how were these ships constructed? He said, well, outer skin of the ship was what looked like aluminum, but on all the tests so far made, there was nothing that had been found by the scientists and experts who had checked into it to indicate that this was any form of aluminum that we know. He said that on the big ship, 2 or 3 men could lift one side of it, but in turn that as many as a dozen of them had crawled up on top of the wing and had made no impression on it whatever. He said that the Air Force, in wanting to move it, found out that they should dismantle it on the ground where they had found it, due to its size. And this began a most interesting study. There were no rivets, there were no bolts, there was nothing on the outer skin that would indicate how the ship was put together. After a long study, It was found, however, that the ship was put together in segments, and they fitted in grooves and were pinned together around the base. When the cabin was gotten out of the bottom of the saucer, they found there a circular gear completely encircling the bottom of the ship. And this gear fitted into a gear that was on the cabin. The whole thing was very ingeniously put together. And there had to be a lot of care taken in breaking it down. After it had been broken down, it was moved to the laboratory, government laboratory at Phoenix. And there it remained for a considerable period of time. The instrument board, to the amazement of Doctor and his brother scientists, was also broken up and all of the inner workings torn apart. This, he said, prevented any further study by them as to the magnetic operation of the ship itself. He regretted this very much because he said that had they been able to keep it intact for a considerable period, there might have come a time and they might have worked out a plan whereby they could make certain tests as to the different push buttons on the instrument board that would have given them the clues to the magnetic form of combustion developed on the ship itself. I said, what has been done with the people on this ship? He said that some of them had been dissected and studied by the medical division of the Air Force, and that from reports that he had received, they had found that these little fellas were, in all respects, perfectly normal human beings. He said that one thing that was outstanding was that their teeth were all perfect. And as near as they could judge from the characteristics and physiology of the bodies, they would be about 35 to 40 years of age, judged by our standards of age of human beings. He said that they all wore the same type of uniform, a dark blue garment, and they had metal buttons. He said it was significant that there was not any insignia of any kind on the collars or on the arms or on the caps of these people. So to all intents and purposes, all of them had the same rank. He said that it might, of course, be possible that they had different ranks among themselves that they were acquainted with, but by our standards of ranking, what we would call Air Force or Army people, there was nothing to indicate who they were nor what they were. Going into the matter of physical possessions on the bodies of the different people, he said that so far as he saw himself, they were very limited, but that there was 2 or 3 pieces which he had had access to that might be considered timepieces. And he said it was very interesting to study these timepieces because they seemed to do their work or functioning without any attention. He said they were about the size of a silver dollar in diameter and a little bit thicker, and that there were 4 markings, one at the top and one of what would be at 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And he said it was suddenly discovered that the inside part of the what they called the timepiece actually moved, but that it took a full magnetic month for it to complete its circle. Now, he said, you know, of course, that a magnetic month is 23 hours and 58 minutes. A magnetic day is 23 hours and 58 minutes. And we found that the time it took to make this complete circumference was over 29 days, and figured out in hours and minutes, totaled exactly that number of magnetic days. He said that there was what appeared to be food on this ship, and that these were little wafers. He said that they fed them to guinea pigs, and they seemed to thrive on them, and that on one occasion, one of these was put into a gallon container of boiling water, and it very quickly boiled over the sides. This was the only evidence of food on the ship. He said there were 2 containers on the ship that contained water, and on checking this water, they found it to be normal in all respects to our water, except it was about twice as heavy. The doctor recalled to me that there was a water in Norway that was about the weight of this water. As I stated a while ago, I continued to ask questions, and to my surprise, the doctor said, "I want you to see these ships." And I said, "Do you mean ships?" And he said, "Oh, yes." He said, "We have 3 of them. In fact, another ship landed near one of the proving grounds in Arizona, and when we got to it, the door was open on this ship. And on looking into it, there were 16 people in it also. And it was evident that they had not been dead more than 2 or 3 hours." I said, "How do you determine the presence of these particular ships?" He said, "Well, of course you must understand that in the laboratories and also at Alamogordo and Los Alamos and at different parts of the country, we have telescope observers who are 24 hours a day watching the telescope for evidence of objects, ships flying in the sky. And everything that comes within the range of these telescopes are noted." He said that the dimensions of the 72-foot ship were comparable in degree to those of the 9900-foot ship. And he said, "We have decided that their mathematical system is in all probability the same as ours, because mathematical law should follow for all the planets in this solar system. And," he said, "our reason for thinking this is because we were all struck with the fact that when the measurements of the ship in all of its parts were broken down, we found that they follow what we call the system of nines." Whereupon the doctor went to considerable length to explain to me the mathematical system of nines. And he said we had to decide and conclude from this clue that in all probability they used a system of mathematics similar to ours in this respect. He said, "By the way," he said, "one of these little ships landed right up above Phoenix in Paradise Valley." And he said, "We got out to it in a hurry, and actually one of the little men was about half out of the escape door, or hatch, as Doctor called it, and he was dead. The other little fellow, there only being 2 people on this ship, was sitting in his seat at the control board. This ship was 36 feet in diameter, and the size of the cabin and all the rest of the dimensions balanced out on the same system of nines that had been found in the other ships." I said, "Did they have any sleeping quarters, or did they have any toilet facilities?" And he immediately explained that on the 72-foot ship there was a very ingenious device by which they found, when they discovered how to operate it, were the sleeping quarters on this ship. He said there was pushed back in the wall what turned out to be a collapsible accordion-type screen. And as it was pulled out, it moved around in a half circle, and by the time it reached the wall of the circular cabin, little hammocks had dropped down from the wall of this screen, or accordion-like wall, and there were the sleeping quarters for these men. He said that the toilet facilities were inside of this sleeping quarter place. And he said that it was amazing when you looked at it to note how small it was, but for their purposes served exactly what they wanted.
During the late 1940s and early 50s, Silas Newton and Leo A. Gerber traveled through Aztec attempting to sell devices known in the oil business as doodlebugs. They claimed that these devices could find oil, gas, and gold, and they could also do so because they were based on alien technology recovered from the supposed crashing of the flying saucer. When J.P. Kahn of the San Francisco Chronicle asked the con men for a piece of metal from the supposed alien device, they provided him with a sample that turned out to be ordinary aluminum. In 1949, author Frank Scully published a series of columns in a Variety magazine retelling the crash story told to him by Newton and Gerber. He later expanded the columns to create Behind the Flying Saucers, a best-selling book that influenced the public perception about UFOs. 4 years later, the hoax was exposed in True magazine. After the article was published, many victims of the pair came forward. One of the victims was a millionaire, Herman Fladler, who pressed charges. The two were convicted of fraud in 1953. Hey, that's our podcast for this week. Thank you so much for taking time to check out our podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe on whatever podcast platform you're listening to. Also, you'll be notified each week when I upload a new episode. To keep up with the latest info about our podcast or just join our community, please follow the Linktree link at the top of our show notes. Also, if you could help me out by leaving a 5-star review and a comment, this will help others find our podcast. And I would love to hear what you think about the podcast, or you can leave a suggestion for a future topic that you'd like me to cover. We'll be back next week with more paranormal, UFO, and fringe news roundup and conspiracy breakdown. Keep searching for the cosmic truth.